Thank you very much for having me here. I'm delighted to come to the Athens Festival in a city that I know and love, and I want to thank especially the British Council for having brought me out here. It's a great delight. What I want to talk about is culture, paradoxically. I know I'm a scientist, I'm a biologist, but I want to persuade you that culture, which is the traditional province of the humanities, you know, historians, literary critics, all those kinds of people. I want to persuade you that it's about time that scientists take that stuff out of their hands and turn it into a science. And I want to try to illustrate how we're going to do that. So what sort of science should a science of culture be? I think that it should be fundamentally a science very much like evolutionary biology. Now, I would say that because, of course, I'm an evolutionary biologist as opposed to, say, a physicist. But the reason why culture should be a science like evolutionary biology is because cultural objects have some things in common with science, with organisms, which are the study of, which biology studies. And one of them is that they're incredibly diverse. So there are millions of species of beetles in the world, and there are millions of different kinds of books, for example, or songs, or whatever. In other words, these are fundamentally a science of diversity. And then there's another thing that cultural objects have in common with biological objects, in that they show the evidence of design, of purpose. So Darwin, of course, wrote an entire book about the explanation for why creatures show design. It's the consequence of natural selection. It's the adaptations that we see in the world. But he wasn't, in fact, the first great theoretician of design. The first great theoretician of design was, of course, our own Aristotle. So there's a wonderful passage in Historia Animalium, this book he wrote about animals, in which he's discussing the shell of a sea urchin. And he says, the shell of a sea urchin, and he discusses its function, he says, and it looks exactly like a lamp. And it looks exactly like a lantern. And ever since then, the structure has been known as Aristotle's lantern. But it's always been a bit mysterious as to exactly what he was talking about until a few years ago, when in a grave out of Thessaloniki, this particular lantern was dug up. It's a 4th century lantern. And if you look at the two, you can see instantly what Aristotle was going on about. It's the sort of structure, this round structure in which you put a candle and it shines light out from inside. But there's a third reason why culture is like biology. And that is that culture, just as organisms are the consequence of the process that Darwin called modification with descent, that is to say, in which creatures evolve into other creatures and they handing down their inheritance from generation to generation, changing subtly as they go, so too is the case with culture. Paul Valéry, the poet, writing about Stéphane Mallarmé, said, whether in science or the arts, if we look for the source of an achievement, we can observe that what a man has done either repeats or refutes what somebody else has done. In other words, he's saying there is not a thing in the world that we make, a song, an artifact, a scientific paper, or whatever, that doesn't somehow draw its inspiration from what somebody else made before that. And just to illustrate this point, I can't resist showing this because this is a lamp that I actually happen to own, made by a young Athenian designer called Niki Dimopoulou. And it's a beautiful object, and it is directly inspired by those old lamps that were dug up near Thessaloniki. And it's a perfect illustration of the fact that when we make something, we always draw on the past, however much we change it. And sometimes when we draw on the past, we get into trouble. So take these guys, for example. Many of you will know Blurred Lines by Robin Thicke and Pharrell Williams. If you know, the song is famous for two things. First of all, for the video, which is dominated by semi-naked young women and is not entirely safe to look at least at work. And secondly, for the fact that these guys, Pharrell Williams and Robin Thicke, were sued by the estate of Marvin Gaye for being, shall we say, generously inspired by their song, by his song, Got to Give It Up. A court in California has ordered Pharrell Williams to pay something like $4.5 million to the estate of Marvin Gaye, which shows you that inspiration can sometimes get you into trouble. The reason that I was speaking about, the reason that I bring up pop music is because if we are going to make a science out of culture, the thing that we need to do is we need to be able to get lots of cultural objects and we need to be able to measure them in some way. And that now is possible for the very first time. And that's in fact why I've been studying pop music over the last few years. So you can now, I mean, the great thing about pop is that all of us have, 10 or 20,000 songs on our iPads or, iPhones. If indeed we actually even have them anymore, maybe we just get, something like the 3.5 million songs in Spotify streamed to us. The point is that now nearly all of culture is available. But what you need is some means to measure it. And if you can measure it, then you can begin to do science. And so that's what we did. So a few years ago with some colleagues of mine, we got the 17,000, how many is it? Yeah, 17,000 songs that constitute the US top 100, the Hot 100 Billboard, and we got them and we measured them. And I won't go into the details of exactly how we measured them, but suffice to say, there's a whole science called musical information retrieval, which is devoted to developing algorithms for measuring music. So there are algorithms which can extract the chords out of a piece of music, or algorithms that can extract the rhythm, and so on and so forth. And there are whole departments of computer engineers devoted to trying to extract information from music in one way or another. So what we do is we get the audio, we extract these features, and we reduce them down to these things that we call topics. And again, I won't go into the statistical details, but essentially a topic is it's a feature which captures some aspect of the musical surface. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. So one of our topics captures the presence of dominant seventh chords in the music. And what you can see here is a graph of the frequency of dominant seventh chords over the last 50 years in the US Hot 100. What you're looking at there, essentially, is the long, slow death of jazz. And next to it, we've got a topic that captures the presence of thrashing guitars, da-na-na-na-na, like that, right? And what you can see is that it rises, it falls, it rises, it falls, it rises again. What you're looking at there is essentially the rise, the fall, the rise, the fall, and the rise of rock and roll. So given this kind of data, you can do all sorts of things with it to begin to explore and understand the history of music. And I would actually say that even though I don't really know much about music myself, I've never been that much of a pop fan, I would actually claim that in some ways I know more about music, the history of music, than anyone. And the reason I say that is because up till now, what we've known about the history of music comes from the recollections of journalists and fans and superannuated pop stars. But here, for the first time, we can begin to actually study it scientifically. So this, for example, is a diagram that shows the relationship. It's a network diagram that shows the relationship as estimated from the music itself between some 5,000 artists who were in the US Hot 100 over the course of the last 50 years. And I call this diagram the penis of pop for obvious reasons. So just to give you a sense of what goes into it here, So, I don't know, forgive me, but the left testicle, that's basically, that's basically, that's rock and roll. At the base, we have country and western. On the right, we have sort of soft pop, you know, mellow kind of stuff, ballads. Then we have R&B there in sort of bright green, and then going out there in the penis itself, I'm not being cute here, we have hip-hop and rap. And you may wonder why the algorithm arranges it. So this is just the way the algorithm arranges it. And the reason it does so is because hip-hop and rap are actually musically more different than any other kind of music in the charts. Primarily because they don't have chords and they've got lots of spoken word in there and very, very particular strong rhythms. And so the algorithm just naturally arranges them and puts it out there. Puts it out there. Here's a question. Diversity. So there are two ideas about how diversity of popular music has changed over time. One idea is, and it's a very common idea, is that once upon a time there was a golden age in which the charts and pop music was incredibly diverse and wonderful, and then the forces of commercialism came along and flattened them all into some sort of homogenized, commercialized mush. So this is a critique that goes back to the early 20th century, especially most obviously written by a guy called Theodor Adorno, who was both a Marxist and a student of Shostakovich, if I remember correctly, and as you might expect, hated both capitalism and popular music, and wrote a stinging critique arguing that that the forces of commercialism have flattened and homogenized popular music. Of course, there's another narrative that runs at the same time, that maybe it's the case that once upon a time, pop music was incredibly homogenous, but now as globalization has advanced and we get music from all over the world, and anything can come into the charts now. After all, you know, Gangnam Style was K-pop, right? Maybe everything is becoming much more diverse. So what's actually the case? All this speculation is nonsense. We can actually measure diversity. And if you measure diversity in the pop charts, what you find is that actually it's been surprisingly constant over the last 50 years, with the exception of the 1980s, which is where you can see it takes a big dip. So what's happening there? The answer is that's due to the rise of the drum machine and the synthesizer, which in the early 1980s gets invented and then just gets plastered across all possible music and just flattens the musical space completely, until a few years later when the natural forces of equilibria sort of reassert themselves and bounce back. When did the music change? Everybody has some sort of narrative as to when the great changes in popular music occurred and when the great revolutions occurred. And it's usually when, if anybody has an idea, it's usually when they were around 17 years old. So when did it actually happen? Well, we can measure that directly. And in this graph, what I've done is I've calculated how much the rate of change of the music from one year to the next. And where you see the colors getting hotter, you know, where they become more yellow and red, that's when the music is changing most. And we find that it changes in 3 times. There are 3 great revolutions in the history of the US charts. One of them is in 1964, one of them is in 1982, centered around there, and the other one is in the early 1990s. So what exactly is happening there? So bear in mind we're talking about the American charts here. There's a story that the British love to tell themselves, and it's about how the British invaded America and changed everything. And of course the story goes, the Beatles arrived at JFK on the 26th of December 1963, met by hordes of screaming girls, and that was the start of the British invasion, and it just changed everything. And indeed, there's no doubt about it, the charts become flooded with all sorts of British acts. Things like, The Who, the Pretty Things, the Kinks, and so on and so forth. But did they actually cause the revolution? The answer is, actually, no. If you measure what's happening at that time, what you can see, and this is what I want to persuade you of, is that these over here we have we're plotting the features of this music, and you can see, I'm afraid that here in the middle, that's around 1964. I'm afraid I've left off the years, unfortunately. You can see that the music is changing, and it's changing continuously throughout the 60s. So it actually begins to change well before the American Revolution actually happened. Sorry, before the British actually arrived. So it seems as though what the Beatles did, and all those other British groups, is that they joined the American Revolution rather than actually caused it. That they may have been perfect for it, that's a separate question. So we did this study a couple of years ago, and we published a paper about it in 2015. And it got quite a bit of news. You know, people like talking about the science of pop music. The BBC, bless them, they asked us to do a program about it, except this time we were going to analyze the UK charts. And we just did this, and it transmitted out in February of this year. And again, we analyzed the Beatles. And we said, how important were the Beatles in the early 1960s? And the answer, which I said on national television, was not very. Well, here's some advice. If you ever have an opportunity to talk to the British people about popular music, do not diss the Beatles. So we have a newspaper in Britain called the Daily Mail. I won't say much more about it. It's a horrible newspaper. They ran on page 3 this full-page thing saying, we can't work it out, Prof, and we really try to see it why top scientists insist Beatles had virtually no influence on pop music. It offers bizarre proof. It was, without a doubt, the most scurrilous piece of journalism that I've ever read, and grossly misrepresented my position. Suffice it to say, the citizens of Liverpool rose up as one and wrote into the Daily Mail and to complain about this professor who had dissed their favorite band. There was something like, I stopped counting it, something like 750 comments on the online version, and nearly all of them were deeply, deeply hostile. So that is the downside of having of engaging with this sort of thing. What is the most important revolution of all? There are 3 of them in American pop. And there's 1964, 1982. 1982, that's the rise of the drum machines and synthesizers. 1990, that's the big one. Now you may wonder what exactly that is. And I suggest to you that this is actually the most important pop song.
I said the hip hop, the hip it to the hip hop. You don't stop the rocker to the bang bang boogie.
Anybody know what it is?
The boogie to the rhythm of the boogie to beat.
That is Sugar Hill Gang, Rapper's Delight. And it turns out that that is the very first hip-hop rap song that makes it onto the charts, and this is in 1980. It only makes it to number 36. It takes another decade for that to filter through, but by the time it does, and by the time American mass-market consumers have learned to love hip-hop, it changes everything, such that it's a revolution that occurs then in the 90s, and without a doubt, it's hip-hop that is by far and away the most influential aspect of the change in American music. Now, as scientists, as biologists, we love to study the evolution of things in the wild, but we also like to do experiments in the lab under highly controlled circumstances. So here's an example of such an experiment. So this is a very famous experiment that's been running for about 40 years now, and it's by a guy called Lenski, and what he's done, it's very simple, I'm not going to tell you about it, it's just he grows these bacteria, E. coli, in the lab, and he's been growing these things and tracking them for about 40 years now, and as he does so, they evolve. And it's a beautiful system, even though it's so simple, you can actually follow how things evolve in great detail and the dynamics of evolution in a way that you can't in the wild. Anyway, inspired by this, we wondered if we could do something similar. So some years ago, we set up a system called Darwin Tunes. And Darwin Tunes is exactly what it sounds like. It's a way of evolving music in the lab. So the way it works is this. So Darwin Tunes, at its heart, is a little algorithm. that generates music. It's called a genetic algorithm. And what this means in this particular case is that it's a little piece of computer code that generates a sound, a little song, about 8 seconds long. And this song, this algorithm, what it does is it generates a population of these songs, about 100 of them at any given time. And the special thing about these songs is that these little bits of computer code, is that they can get together. They can have sex, as it were, and they can make baby songs. So we begin in this experiment with just a bunch of loops which have their musical qualities just generated at random. And you can imagine that if you generate 100 little songs with their music qualities, their notes and the rhythms and so forth at random, you get 100 terrible sounding songs. But what you do then is, if you let those songs have baby songs, have sex and have baby songs, and their genomes get mixed up, you can imagine that the baby songs sound equally terrible. You need some way to generate the music out of all this random force. And the force that we use is Darwin's force. It's natural selection. So what we do is we took those songs, we streamed them to the web, and we asked people to rate them. And we said, and we just asked them, rate them from 1 to 5. I love them, I hate them. And we then took the songs that people liked, and we let them breed and make baby songs, and the ones that people didn't like, we killed them off. All right, so you do that for 50,000 generations. You get about 7,000 people listening, 85,000 generations. And we did this with some of my students as well, so we had extra channels. And what you find is that music evolves. This is the preference, the musicality of the music, how much people like it over time. And you find that it evolves very, very quickly. And in fact, what you even find is that even though there are no rhythms or chords or any real explicit musical qualities programmed in, they evolve naturally, so we can measure the rhythmicity of the music, and we can measure how many chords are in the music, and we find that these things evolve as well. And you can map how this music, how this population of music is changing as it evolves up what we call in biology an adaptive landscape. But to really get a sense of what it likes, of how this works, you've got to actually listen to the music. And let me just, I'm first going to play you a compilation of what they sound like when they begin. Okay, so this is what people have to listen to initially, and they have to judge this and rate this from 1 to 5. And as you can see, it's pretty hard going. In fact, quite a lot of people, they spend about 5 seconds listening to this stuff and they say, okay, well, that's enough for me for the experiment. Okay. We run this experiment then for 6,000 generations. This is a couple of months of real time. And what we end up with is something like this. I don't say it's Mozart. I mean, it's somewhere between, electronica and a pretty good ringtone. But the thing you have to appreciate here is that in this system, there's no composer. Or to put it another way, there are thousands of composers. All there is an algorithm that is generating music at random, sounds at random, and then it's consumers who are selecting and choosing among them. Add to that the force of natural selection, and you can see how things evolve, which raises the interesting question. In the music that we actually listen to, how much of it is actually due to the music, to the people who we think make the music? That is to say, to the composers and the artists. I would argue that actually much of the music that we listen to is actually shaped by ourselves, the consumers, by the choices that we make when we choose one song or another. If this is true, then you should be able to develop algorithms which actually identify success. So one of the experiments that the BBC asked us to do is they said, we have a problem. We have this thing called BBC Introducing, and essentially it's a website. And if you're a musician, you and anybody in Britain can upload their music, you know, the stuff you've made in your garage, and you can upload it to this thing called BBC Introducing, this website, and the BBC promises that some DJ will listen to it, and if they like it, they'll play it at first on local radio, let's say something like Radio Kent, and if they really like it, then it gets played on National Radio 1, and you can become famous. It's a way for the BBC to keep tabs on all the music that's sort of happening out there in the underground, and it's a way of also bringing out talent, you know, without going through the record companies and so forth. But here's the catch. The BBC get around 2,000 hours of this stuff per week uploaded, right? And they promise that their DJs are going to listen to it all. So that's a lot of DJ time that has to be spent across the country listening to what is, I have to say, a lot of terrible music, right? I mean, because anybody can upload their stuff. If you're singing in the shower and you record it on your iPhone, you too can upload it onto BBC Introducing, and somebody at the BBC's got to listen to it. So they said, can you help us? Can you develop an algorithm that will enable us to sort through all this stuff? So we said, all right, we'll try. And the technique that we used is part of these new fantastic machine learning algorithms. This is a neural net, and I'm not going to go into the details of it, but it is part of these new AI-related algorithms which are revolutionizing our lives in so many ways, which are being used for image recognition, sound recognition, face recognition, and all these different things. And what we did, and the way this works roughly, is that you have to teach the algorithm what a good song sounds like. So what we did is we took one of these algorithms and we trained it to listen for the charts. We trained it as to what the charts are. And you can train it to learn, even if the charts are quite complicated, it's so clever that it will learn that there are many different kinds of good music that can be in the charts. And then what we did is we took that algorithm and we released it upon the BBC Introducing data, or at least part of it. We released it on about 2,000 songs that happened to have been uploaded from one part of the country, from Kent, over the course of 1 month. And we said, go find us in all that stuff the songs that are most likely to be successful, that are going to have the potential to be charts. And bear in mind, we don't know anything about these songs. They're just, they're just entirely obscure and unsigned artists. And what we came up with, we got a list of choices. We ranked our choices, and number one were these guys, the Modern Strangers, two nice young guys from Kent, and their song Margarita. And I just want you to listen to this because I think it's a great song. And here's the thing, it was chosen by computer, no DJs.
Sit back, Margarita, nice and slow.
I don't know what your tastes are, but I think Margarita's pretty good. And we managed to pick that out, and a bunch of other songs like it out of the charts. And I think these guys are going to be doing very well. Which raises the question, all right, so we can pick out of a load of dross, out of thousands of songs, we can pick out songs that are pretty good, that, could conceivably go into the charts. But can we actually pick out a song that would be a genuine hit? I actually think that we can't. And the reason I think we can't is because of a fundamental indeterminacy in how culture is shaped. This is a chart of YouTube views of some 2,000 songs that were released in the week of 1 week in October 2015. And it happened to be the week in which Adele's Hello was released. And this chart, it's a slightly funny way of plotting the data. It's called a cumulative distribution. But on this axis, on the x-axis, what you have is the number of views that any given song would have. And on the other axis, you have the number of songs that have that many views. And what you can see here is that we have, on the one hand, an extreme, we have Adele's Hello, which in its first week of views got 34 million views on YouTube, versus the least viewed song, which was a song called Doc Niggas Never Know by Doc Shah Rock. I don't recommend that you actually track this particular one down. It only got 2 views, which suggests that even they weren't even looking at their own their own track. What this plot shows is what we already know, that the world is a hugely unequal place. If you made a plot of an income distribution, it would look like this, or success of almost any type, you find that they look like this. You find that most things that people produce, most things that people do, most people are not very successful, while a handful of people, just a small number of people and a small number of artifacts, designs, songs, get all the rewards. And the extremes of the differences are enormous. I mean, and you have to wonder why this is. Now, Niggas Never Know by Doc Shah Rock is a bad song. And you may say that Adele's Hello is a good song. But even the most charitable person would hardly say that it's like, 16 million times better than, Adele's not 16 million times better than Doc Shah Rock. I mean, they both managed to basically produce sort of functional songs. So what is it that makes for this success? And can we predict it? And actually, I think the answer is no, we can't. And the reason for that is because of the dynamics of crowds. There's an experiment that some scientists did about 10 years ago, Salignac et al., and it's a great experiment. And what they did was this. They got a whole bunch of kids to listen to songs from unsigned bands and rate them. And they did the experiment in 2 ways. First of all, they got the kids to listen to the songs and rate them in isolation. So nobody knew what everybody else liked. And it turns out that when you do that, everybody likes pretty much the same thing. The kids have a general consensus as to what constitutes quality. And then what you do is you get another bunch of kids and you get them to rate the same songs, but this time you allow them to talk to each other. And it turns out, and this is what you can see on this plot, this is the rank of the songs as ranked independently. And you can see that at the top, the ones that are right at the top, those tend to be, when you rank them, you have the influenced population in which they can talk to each other. They sort of agree there. And the really terrible songs, they kind of agree a little bit. But you can see that basically there's almost no correlation between them. And why is this? And the answer is because of herd effects. It is because when people talk to each other, then our independent aesthetic criteria practically go out of the window, and almost anything can become successful just because of the dynamics of social networks, essentially. And that's the thing. As our social networks become ever more dense and connected via all our social media, what it means is that you can get these huge viral effects which just sweep through, and you get the most unpredictable songs becoming successful. Adele's Hello might be indeed have some virtues. It speaks to girls, it's all about love and loss, and she's got a great voice and so on and so forth. But what can explain Gangnam Style, for example? That truly is a case of the madness of crowds, and we are seeing these effects ever more, and that is a fundamental indeterminacy that I just don't think that science can crack. I've spoken about pop music, but I didn't have to just speak about pop, because the truth is that we can do the kind of stuff that we've done with pop here. We can do this for practically anything. It's just a matter of how to measure, or first of all, getting the objects. And you can now get the objects because almost everything in culture has been digitized or is being digitized. If you want to study paintings, there are databases with millions of paintings that you can download. If you want to study books, there are tens of thousands of books free, and if you want to pay for them, Amazon have at least a few million electronic books online. The entire scientific literature is available online, and data about all sorts of things. So this just shows you some data about the evolution of three different things, or four different things. There's the pop music again. There on the top right where you see the book, that's a database of some 20,000 Irish American and British novels from the 19th century, which we've measured various qualities in this, and you're looking there at the evolution of that. Then there's the little stethoscope there, concerns the study of something like 200,000 scientific papers which concern from the British Medical Journal. So that's essentially the history of British clinical science in a single graph. And I could give you a whole lecture and tell you about all the things that you can discover doing this kind of thing. On the right, that's the history of American cars. It's based upon 20,000 car models. Once you realize that you can begin to analyze cultural objects in this way, you realize that there's a whole new science to be done here, a quantitative science, and it's one that scientists should begin to do. As a biologist, I'm sometimes asked, why is it that I've started doing this kind of science? And you know, it's especially, you know, my colleagues will sometimes ask me this because you know, biology is a powerful and prestigious science, right? And I work in a biology department, and here I am studying pop music. It does seem a little, you know, a little down class, right? The answer that I give, at least when I'm being a little bit pompous, is that I say, I draw my inspiration from the founder of biology. So the founder of biology was, of course, Aristotle, and he wrote a whole bunch of books about it. He, in his day, had to fight against Plato and the Academy, who said that the only things worth studying were the stars themselves, in their perfect divinity going around in the celestial sphere. He actually writes, he says, animals or squishy things, disgusting things, they're worth studying too, and he devotes years to it. But here's the thing that he also does, is that he not only writes a book about animals and a book about the heavens, but he also writes a book on poetics, famously. And if you ever read the poetics, and it is worthwhile reading, it may surprise you actually how little poetry there is in the poetics. And the reason for that is very simple, is that it's because it's an analysis of poetry written by a biologist. What he wants to know is how drama works and how it puts together, and he cuts it up and murders it completely. But he analyzes it in a completely wonderful way. He had a vision of a universal science, and it is a vision that we have lost, but I think we should reclaim. I don't mention Aristotle simply because I'm talking to an Athenian audience. I mention him because actually I love him, and it so happens that I've written an entire book about him. And I put this up, which was published a couple of years ago, I put this up not to urge you to go out and buy it, but rather to wait until later this year, which the Greek translation comes out. and I think if all being well, we are in September or somewhere around there of this year, we're going to the Greek translation will be coming out, and we'll be having some sort of Aristotelian party to celebrate the unity of science, and I hope to see you all there. Thank you very much.